Welcome back, Honors. Oh man, I hope y'all are having a fun and relaxing and chill like Thanksgiving break. I know I'm enjoying this. The fact that it's Tuesday already is blowing my mind, all right? So I figured I would give y'all a whole weekend without these flips going up just to give you some time to decompress and kind of get a breather, right? And remember, you'll have also the extra Monday after we come back to get these done and get everything kind of moving in the right direction, which is awesome because green and white days are on Tuesday, right? Or green and white days are on Monday and Tuesday, all right? So let's get into it though. These flips are meant to be like 15 and 10 minutes each, give or take, to get us introduced and into the Renaissance, right? So I love this unit, mainly because I love art and I love intelligence and I love regrowth of economics and things like that. Some of you are like, economics? Well, that's the thing, is that's what mostly all this hinges on, right? So let's keep pushing though, and let's kind of take a second to set the stage for the Renaissance and kind of move into it versus just kind of being like, it happened, right? So looking at what we talked about, right? Looking at the last unit, which a lot of y'all did very well on that test, by the way. There may be a young lady that got 100 on there that I hate to have to tell her that she got it because it's going to bruise my ego and inflate hers, but we'll talk about that later on. All right, so the biggest thing is the ancient empires, right? We were talking about the Middle Ages. We talked about how, like, it was let me do it this way because y'all read left to right. Yeah, so the ancient period that included Greece and Rome and also Egypt and Mesopotamia. I hear you, Allie. All that stuff. And then we have the modern era, which is what we're about to get into now with the beginning of the Renaissance. And then we have Then we have the Middle Ages in the middle, right? Medieval Latin referring to the Middle Ages, right? Well, looking back at the ancient empires and looking at how crusty let me get some of this light down a little bit. Looking at how crusty the Middle Ages were when it comes to like culture and art and intellectual activity and different ideas like that. Looking at all these different dynamics, we're looking at a really, really backwards kind of era. When look at all the stuff that the Greeks and the Romans created that actually went away during the Middle Ages, right? The Greeks had philosophy, history, theater, democracy, architecture, the Olympics, science, math, all these amazing things, right? The Romans had an organized military, republics, roads and infrastructure, aqueducts, a three-branch government, Roman law, the Julian calendar, like all these amazing things. And then the Middle Ages hit, right? So the Middle Ages hits, of course, after the fall of Rome. It's a transitional period between the ancient and the modern eras, right? The only really, really big things to come out of it was it established the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church. It established the feudal system. Jot that down. It established the feudal system in Western Europe being the dominant force instead of the empire system that was actually used in the Byzantine era. It established the growth and the power of individual kings spread all over Europe. Jot that down as well. Established the growth and power of individual kings spread out all over Europe. And honestly, it established kind of a primitive base economy, right? So the other big thing about it we like to point out is that Europe wasn't completely in the dark, right? Because we know the Easterners were having a golden age, and we know the Byzantinians held on until the 1400s. But also, though, something you need to know is that, like, the Middle Ages did see a massive growth in economics during the High Middle Ages. Now, we're talking about a growth from the early Middle Ages to the High Middle Ages. The Romans had a wildly better economic system and economic planning than the Middle Ages ever even could bat an eye at, right? But from the early Middle Ages into the High Middle Ages, you saw massive economic growth, right? There was a rise there was the return of trade, right, which was huge, which kind of ended up biting them in the butt in 1347. That plague everywhere. And then you also had the rise of guilds, which is a very, very important thing. Now, notice I say the rise of. They haven't fully developed by this point. They're just kind of starting to develop at this point. Just notice I have a star next to guilds. We're going to come back to guilds here in a second, okay? We're going to talk about what they are and kind of keep pushing forward with all that stuff because they were established during the High Middle Ages, but they didn't see their true growth until the late Middle Ages, right? But then the late Middle Ages hit. So we had early Middle Ages. Economies are kind of crusty. High Middle Ages, whoosh, huge growth, right? But then the Middle Ages hit. and economics dipped. Economies dipped because we got the Black Death, the Avignon Papacy, right, which I learned about in religion class when there were multiple popes all over the place, right? Then we had the 100 Years' War, and then we had also like all these terrible, a famine hit during the late Middle Ages. Like, it's a big issue. But surprisingly enough, even though these terrible things happened, economics and economies leapt forward after those events, right? They did dip for a little while, right? It was early Middle Ages, high Middle Ages economics, late Middle Ages, and then it just exploded following that, right? And a lot of people attribute it to a lot of different reasons. This is like an AP construct. I teach this in AP European, that a lot of it has to do with smaller competition. The money that was circulating through Europe, now that so many people are dead because of this and because of this, is now in the hands of less people, giving the growth of economics and lurching it forward instead of spreading out monetary value so thin. Population was leveled out. Keener competition was actually used, and a lot of other different stuff. Speaking of keener competition, this is a big reason why. All right, so this right here is the economy of the Middle Ages going into the Renaissance, right? The growth. But explosion of economy of the Middle Ages, right? But explosion after the late Middle Ages or whatever. But this is one of the biggest and most important things. And these things are going to endure until the 1700s, right? Like, so they're called guilds, right? There are two types of guilds, as you can see right here. There is a craft guild and a merchant guild, which is a trader, right? So what they do is they create these groups to try and create a better market value for their price. They set a standard on rules of quality, and then what they also can do is they get to organize the distribution of their product, right? Now, this is going to help make a lot of money because it actually sets up a more narrow and keener competitive level, right? So this way, you don't have everybody running around trying to create different quality goods. Now you have guilds that are in charge of creating certain items, right? Like, for example, if anybody's watching The Mandalorian right now, which I know some of you are scoffing off, and you're like, oh my god, what a nerd. But The Mandalorian is a part of a guild. He's a part of a bounty hunter's guild, right? They refer to it a lot, right? So what they do, though, is they set rules and regulations for economic materials, and then that way you're actually setting up a better market value for your good and making more money off of it, right? It also sets up a different idea to try and get people off these lands that they're serfs and working on and get them integrated into the economy with a skill, right? So the big thing about a guild is that, let's use an example, right? Let's say, hypothetically, Sophie Stubbs is a guild member, right? She is a master craft worker. She makes shoes. She's in a cobbler's guild, right? She's in a cobbler's guild, and she's one of the masters. And then you got people right around her like Shannon Weiss, right? Shannon is a serf on a fief, and she is tired of it. Her contract is up. She does not want to farm anymore. She wants to try and figure out a way to make more money. She would join a guild like Sophie's, be an apprentice, learn from Sophie's mastership, and then go out and start another branch of the guild on her own, right? So it's a way to train people as well, and it's a way to reintroduce specific positive economic flow back into Europe, right? So also, even agriculture is going to improve, right? You had the improvement of agriculture through the farmers actually starting to specialize their crops, right? This is a big thing as well. Farmers began to actually farm things like cash crops instead of just mundane things, right? Instead of just farming legumes and wheat to feed one fief at a time, farmers start to branch out and they start to farm cash crops like sugar beets or sugar cane or oats and barley that actually make them more money, right? So that's specialization of their crop. That way, they can actually grow specific things more regularly and sell it at a higher market value, right? Boom! This is huge as well. City-states, though, are also going to start becoming more specialized according to their location. And this is particularly in Italy, which is the bedrock of the Renaissance, right? Italy is the place where the Renaissance explodes, all right? Because here's the thing. Let's talk about the state of Italy before we go anywhere further, right? The state of Italy during the Middle Ages going into the Renaissance is that they are extremely politically divided, right? All of the Italian states are broken up, and they are not a part of what you would call a central core Italy, right? Let's throw this out there. Italy is a younger country than America, all right? So, hot take. I know some of you are like, well, there's no way. Yeah, Italy has its roots in ancient Rome, and it has more ancient culture than America does. But America has been a country since 1776, and Italy has only been a country, I think, since 1819. Italy becomes a country. 1861. Wow, I'm way off. 1861. We're almost 100 years older than Italy is, right? As a unified country, right? Now, getting into it, though, this is Italy, okay? You can choose to draw this map if you want, all right? I suggest it because it's going to be on the test, or if you want to take a screenshot of what I'm talking about, that's completely fine, too. But we have 3 very important Italian states that are reintroducing economies based on their location, right? Which is massively important, and we all need to know. The big ones are Venice, Milan, and Florence, right? So we'll get to the other guys here in a minute. Well, let's talk about Venice first, right? So Venice starts to specialize according to its location because they become the best trade importer and merchant city in the entirety of Europe, all right? So the biggest thing about Venice is their location and where they are actually located in the Mediterranean or on the border of the Adriatic Sea, because they have direct shipping lanes over to 2 very, very powerful empires, both existing at 2 different times, right? Because they were the ones that, with their direct shipping lanes, could create exclusive trade agreements with the Byzantine Empire and the Ottomans, and being the exclusive supplier of those luxury goods into the rest of Europe, right? We're talking silk, spices, tea, what else? Chinese porcelain, luxury goods are all coming in through the ports of Venice, right? And they're only coming in through the ports of Venice. No one else even had a shot at actually bringing these things in due to Venice's location, all right? Some of y'all are like, what about, like, Sicily? Nah, they're still too agrarian, right? They're still too backwards in their ways of farming. Venice was able to create an entire city built on top of canals, made specifically for trading. It flooded really bad, like, last month, just to give you a heads up. They're dealing with a lot of stuff with, like, climate change and, like, their tide systems, but they have an insanely cool thing called the Mose system. I'll talk about it later, where it actually, like, blocks, I can't help it, where it actually blocks, it raises and lowers with the tides to try and keep the floods back as much as it possibly can. It's really cool. Bill Nye did a whole session, or a whole thing on it. Then Milan, right? Milan, look at it. Where are we going? Milan, located up here in northern Italy, right, is going to become a trade hub, right? So all the goods that are coming in from Venice need to cross the Alps to get into the rest of Europe, right? To reinvigorate these economies, to create these raw materials so these guilds can actually create more goods. Well, Milan becomes the trade hub of those places. All those goods must pass through Milan to get across the Alps and then into all of Europe. So they become the place, the locale, where all these goods can be found, and then they're redistributed again, right? Milan also gets taken over by mercenaries and the Sforza family later on. But we'll talk about that at a different date, all right? So, but the trade hub of Milan is a massively important thing. But then my favorite out of all of them is Florence, right? So Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, the birthplace of the Renaissance, if you will, the epicenter, the focal point, Florence. If you ever get a chance to go, I highly recommend it. It literally is the hub of the Renaissance when it comes to intellectual activity, right? They were best known for textiles, which is the creation of cloth, right? Particularly wool. Actually, at one point, the Medici family, who is also in charge of these, which we'll talk about in the next flip, their biggest thing was they discovered a large deposit of this stuff called alum, A-L-U-M, and it's used to dye fabrics blue. And so you could actually only get blue-dyed fabrics from the Florentinians, right? So, or the Florentians? What are people? Hey, Siri! What are people from Florence called?
I found an answer. It's displayed on your iPhone.
This did nothing. Man, Siri is not good anymore. All right, so anyway, I think they're Florentines. Anyway, we'll talk about it later. Now, anyway, so textiles and banks, right? So some of y'all are like, well, what do you mean textiles? How can textiles be that big of a deal? You see this beautiful building that my wife and I are standing in front of whenever we went to Florence? I don't want to give this away because somebody's going to be presenting on it, But this entire building and the dome upon it was constructed and created by the Wool Guild of Florence, the Wool Merchants Guild, right? They're the ones who were in charge of actually creating this beautiful, beautiful structure, right? So, as you can tell, I'm a big, big Florence fan. And then we have one more other state to worry about. Because some of y'all right now are saying, well, Mr. Terry, what about Rome? Where does Rome fall into all this? Well, that's the thing. Rome was actually inside of this other really, really big area known as the Papal States, right? Right about here. See the big chunk right here? The big yellow? That was the Papal States. The Papal States was Rome and the center section of Italy, which was governed and ruled over by the Catholic Church, and the Pope was the de facto king of this area, right? They had actually had this state since the era of Charlemagne, because Charlemagne defended them from these people called the Lombards, right? So, and to try and curry favor with the Pope, he actually gives him the center section of Italy, and he's like, look, let this be the state for the papacy. This is the Papal States now, right? And then you have a lot of popes that are going to take massive advantage of this. Like, you got Julius II, who is also called the Warrior King, or the Warrior Pope, who goes out and starts trying to take over all these other crazy different places. But anyway, we'll talk about that stuff later on. You do need to know about the Papal States, and you need to know about the three big city-states of Italy, and that's where we're going to cut this flip off for now, and then we're going to get into kind of just Renaissance culture and the birth of that whole system, right? I'll see you guys in a second.